Hi there. Welcome to another edition of Israel Explained. Today, obviously, we'll be talking about the Iranian attack on Israel, the amazing Israeli success in stopping it, and, of course, potential Israeli response to this attack. Will they or won't they? Should they or shouldn't they? And so forth. So let's start with the facts. The attack on Israel was significantly larger than Israeli intelligence expected, they have now said. We're talking about 185 UAVs, 110 ballistic missiles, and 36 cruise missiles, all shot in it onto Israel within a short period of time. They carried roughly 160 tons of explosives overall. All the UAVs and missiles were shot down by Israel and its allies. The vast majority of ballistic missiles were intercepted. Only a handful landed in the Dead Sea area and in the Nevatim Air Force Base, where no severe damage was reported. Any reports you're hearing that Israeli bases were more seriously hit are Iranian propaganda. There was one serious injury from shards. One young Bedouin girl was seriously injured. Her life is not in danger, last I heard. But even that was from a shot down. I think that was a UAV. Iran's declaring victory and acting very tough, but they know it didn't go very well, and they're preparing for an Israeli counterattack. The Islamic Republic has closed down several airports. Its currency is crashing. Stock markets have closed after showing some rough numbers before the weekend because of the attack that it was anticipating. Meanwhile, in Israel, none of those things are happening. Israel is feeling confident and robust after what was, at least on a tactical level, a major victory. Now, Israeli decision makers agree that a response to this is warranted, but they disagree on how and where. And we'll talk about that a little bit. But it is important to talk about why this was so important. There were some historical elements here, some real changes in the Middle Eastern conflict, which may reverberate well into the future. First and foremost, Iran changed the normal equation um, of how they handle Israel. They've used a proxy system, what Israel calls an octopus system, of trying to choke it with various arms coming from every direction, and have generally avoided taking Israel on head on, which has worked very well for Iran. So it's not clear if switching to this model of direct response is actually good for Iran. It takes away its plausible deniability and puts it in a lot of risk. But of course, it also exposes Israel to certain risks. Another thing that is historical about what happened is the cooperation between Israel and its allies. Some countries, which, aren't even openly considered allies at all. So when the missiles were shot, four countries launched planes to try to intercept them from coming to Israel. We're talking about the United States, France, UK, and most historically and surprising of all, Jordan. Now, this is the first time Israel's fought along with France and the UK since 1956, the Suez crisis, which did not go particularly well. This went a lot better. And the use of Jordanian aircraft is the first time an Arab country has ever openly fought and risked the lives of its soldiers to defend Israel. An absolute milestone in the conflict. Less openly, the UAE, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt were also involved in the efforts yesterday to locate and shoot down missiles and were very helpful by all accounts. Now, something else that's getting lost here is how much of an achievement this was for the Biden administration. The Biden administration managed to turn danger coming from an Iranian attack into Israel into several major achievements. It showed support for Israel and for its allies and showed how it's willing to stand up to Iran at a time when Israeli and U.S. relations had been seriously strained. It helped create a broad coalition against Iran, something the U.S. has been working on for a long time to try to bring the moderate states in Israel closer together to face Iran. And it may have prevented, we don't know this one yet, destabilizing regional or even global war widening by restraining the Israeli response, or at least trying to restrain the Israeli response. Now, that's another thing worth talking about. How was this response restrained? So, we are getting two conflicting reports of what happened in the immediate aftermath of the Iranian attack. Barack Ravid at Axios reported that the United States basically vetoed an Israeli response. Biden forbade Netanyahu from responding, at least immediately, with a military strike. Channel 12, however, reports the U.S. only requested coordination and has not forbid an operation. The truth is probably somewhere in between. I don't believe it was a veto, but the United States certainly did not want an immediate and hasty response. I think that Israel has a good chance of getting the U.S. to go along with some sort of response that will serve its interest of maintaining its deterrence. And we'll talk a little bit about that later on. At the same time that Netanyahu was talking to Biden, Foreign Minister Israel Katz was receiving phone calls from the French Foreign Minister and the British Foreign Minister asking Israel not to respond. So a lot of pressure not to respond. In the meantime, there were debates in the cabinet. People were jumping in and out the cabinet meeting to talk to foreign leaders. This was all happening very fast. Most of the cabinet wanted to wait for the results of the attack. They were concerned about American pressure. They wanted to see how much damage the Iranian attack would do before anything was decided. Two members of the cabinet wanted an immediate strike. Those were Gantz and Eisenkot. But everyone else in the cabinet, also the IDF chief of staff and Netanyahu, especially after he talked to Biden, were against that. And therefore, that did not happen. Now, I've talked to some people in the Air Force, and they've told me that the technical feasibility of that sort of attack is very limited. Because of all the warnings about an Iranian attack, the IAF was set up for defense that night. They were trying to shoot down all these missiles and UAVs that were coming to Israel. If they wanted to attack Iran, they would have had to come back, land, rearm, and only then take off to Iran. That's problematic, not only because it would take a long time and is very difficult, puts a lot of strain on the pilots, but also it could jeopardize the defense. After all, Israel didn't know when the attack would end, how many missiles would be shot. So having a bunch of aircraft going off to attack Iran with that kind of uncertainty seemed like a very bad idea, and that's why the chief of staff and most of the cabinet were indeed against it. Another possible response that it seems Israel is capable of doing is cutting off the power to Tehran through cyber attacks and various other means. It might have been a pretty good idea to do just to show Iran that this sort of thing has consequences. Also, that is not necessarily as escalatory as a direct attack, while possibly being more damaging, but that was not done. Now, once the missiles had been counted, the damage had been ascertained, and the consequences had been accounted for, Israel was surprised by two things. One, the attack was more significant than it expected. The 300 and something that had been launched at Israel were a much larger number than was expecting to see, which was probably something closer to 100. But on the flip side, the amount of damage that those more missiles and UAVs had caused was actually a lot lower than expected. As much as Israel believed in its defense systems, it didn't believe its defense systems would operate quite that well. One of the things it hadn't believed is that the allies would take it so seriously and do such a good job, which made the job of the Israeli systems much easier. So once they saw that there was less damage, even though there were more attacks, that lowered the desire to launch some kind of major military operation. The talk that Netanyahu had with Biden and the talk that Israel Katz had with the French and British foreign ministers strengthened the trend of not responding it, but it did not create. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not going to be a response. There will be a response. The more I'm talking to people, the more I'm hearing, there will be a response. But there's a serious argument within the cabinet over when and where. Uh, Benny Gantz made it clear that there will be some sort of response today. He said, quote, "We will exact a price on Iran in the manner and at the time that is right for us." So what I'm reading there is that Israel will respond, but will do so in coordination with the United States. I think Israel believes the United States will allow it to do something, and it's better when dealing with Iran to have the backing of the United States Otherwise, it could end up in a regional war without its allies, and we've seen how important the allies are for any regional operation. One thing I heard on Channel 12 that I was encouraged by is that Netanyahu and the government are trying to leverage the restraint into some sort of far reaching strategic alliance against Iran. Now, the United States has been trying to create that kind of far reaching alliance against Iran, but Saudi Arabia in particular, but other Arab states as well, have been demanding concessions as far as a two-state solution is concerned. Netanyahu obviously doesn't want to do that. It's not clear that he politically could, even if he wanted to. Therefore, he wants to leverage the restraint that Israel is showing into concessions there. I don't know if that'll work, but it's certainly worth a shot. And it shows some creativity from Netanyahu, which I like seeing. And it shows that Israel is willing to restrain itself right now, which I think ultimately is a very good idea. And it also shows a willingness to work with the partners, which ultimately will advance the cause of peace, in my opinion. So now Israel really has to decide how fiercely it's responding, when it's responding, how it's responding, and so on and so forth. There are still reasons to respond, and these are the reasons that Israel is saying that it will. This is, as I said, a move away from the traditional Iranian proxy strategy. It's an attempt to create a new equation. If Israel shows that it's okay with this equation, then we have a situation where this will happen repeatedly. In addition, we're talking about the Middle East, about as rough a neighborhood as you can imagine, and a lack of response could be interpreted as weakness. And what happens to weak actors in this area is not good. There's sharks that eat them up. But there are also significant factors inhibiting a very strong Israeli response. I would say almost ruling out a very strong Israeli response. If Israel responds harshly, especially in a way that the United States does not approve, what could happen is Israel opens up a third front while it has yet to conclude either of the other two fronts. I've already said several times I don't think Israel should be opening another front in Lebanon because I don't know how that will end. A front in Iran is far more dangerous. There's really very little Israel can achieve by escalating directly against Iran. It will be satisfying because Iran is behind October 7th, Iran is behind Hezbollah, they're the head of the snake, and there's nothing that supporters of Israel want more than to crush it. But if anyone has dreams that an Israeli attack will overthrow the Iranian regime or that it will be able to destroy the Iranian nuclear program, that's not something you can do in one attack. That's something that would require an entire campaign, an entire war. I don't think Israel could achieve it even through an entire war, because after all, the odds of success for that sort of operation are lower than the odds of success in Gaza, and I would say even lower than the odds of success in Lebanon, and those are already proving elusive enough. You have to keep in mind it's very easy to blow things up. We've seen that in Gaza. It's very difficult to achieve political goals through military force. Politics are essential to this. Maintaining your allies are essential to this, as we've seen. So Israel has a balance. If it strikes too much, it'll pay a price. If it strikes too little, it'll pay a price. I think the risks in striking too little are lower than the risks in striking too much. And from what I'm seeing from the Israeli response, which is quite restrained, I think most Israeli decision makers agree. So we're going to see an Israeli response. It's not going to come immediately, and it will be designed, in my opinion, to keep the threshold from full escalation. And it's much more likely to work if it's in coordination with the United States, which therefore I think it is. So I'm optimistic. I've been very pessimistic about the war in Gaza lately. I'm optimistic. Israel managed to come with its out with the upper hand after yesterday, and the way it's responding, I think, is very responsible. So hopefully, we'll see Israel come out with its hands on top and without dragging itself into another front, which is the last thing that it needs right now. Okay, I got a bunch of questions from you, as usual. Awesome, you guys rock. Let me answer the question from Tara first. You said that you still held out some flickering hope there could be a day after plan in Gaza that leads to regional normalization and a better political horizon between Israel and the Palestinians. Can you walk us through the most likely scenario where something like this comes to fruition? Will it require a second invasion of Gaza to thoroughly rout Hamas? What other scenario could conceivably remove Hamas from power in Gaza? If Hamas is not ejected, how could any political horizon possibly begin to take root? Okay, that's a big question. Ultimately, it doesn't look like any of that's going to happen, like I said. But have I given up completely on it happening? No. And the reason for that is because Israel's out of Gaza right now, clearly temporarily. Israel will probably go back in. Once it goes back in, it needs to figure out what the goals of its military operation are. The only goal that makes sense to me is to replace Hamas. How do you do that? You go in, you hold territory, you start talking to your international partners, you bring them in. Netanyahu's been resisting that, but Netanyahu won't necessarily be in charge forever. If Israel has control of the Gaza Strip and Netanyahu is removed, other prime ministers, whether it's Gallant, Gantz, Eisenkot, Lapid, anyone else I can think of who could actually be prime minister, they're more likely to work with the Americans and the coalition. And I think what happened yesterday, and the extent of the cooperation Israel had with the its coalition members, bodes well for the ability to cooperate on this too. So I think Netanyahu is blocking it. He won't necessarily always be there. And I don't think we've heard the last of Israel's operation in Gaza either. Tara also asks, did the JCPOA slow Iran's progress towards a nuclear weapon? If it had been in place, would they be nuclear armed right now? Or did the sanctions relief turbocharge the expansion of Iranian influence in Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and the rest of the region? Yeah, so that's an entire show, honestly. But the JCPOA did indeed slow down the development of nuclear arms by Iran. Since it's expired, they've made a lot of progress towards it. Just a couple of days ago, the Washington Post put out a story. I'll just quote some of the headline from it. 6 years after the Trump administration withdrew from the Iran nuclear accord, Tehran is rapidly accumulating enriched uranium, some of it very close to weapons grade. Experts fear that a bomb could be a short dash away. End quote. And we have no verification over exactly where Iran is. They could be more advanced than we think. It does appear that the agreement, which Iran certainly violated in many ways, slowed down the program, and now that is not the case. As for whether the sanctions did anything to increase the expansion of Iranian influence, Iranian influence was very high during the JCPOA years before and after. I'm not sure there's really been that much but difference. At the end of the day, American policy towards Iran isn't really the determining factor. It matters, but it's not the determining factor. Iran wants to rule the Middle East, and it's been doing a very good job of moving there, regardless of what the United States does, and that's the truth. Pratchett Guyman asks, I've seen occasional news articles mentioning that Iranian dissidents in the country either express pro Israel sentiments or refuse to participate in the regime's pro Palestinian demonstrations as a proxy for their discontent with the Iranian government on internal issues. Might this also keep Iran from going too far? Okay, so we already know that this didn't keep Iran from going far. They had a bigger response than expected. I will say this, there's a lot of talk about how strong anti government sentiment is in Iran. And there's plenty of people in Iran who are against the government. I'm always very skeptical of the claim that this is some kind of overwhelming amount of people. I think it's urban elites. I think the urban elites are divided over how much they hate the regime. I think that what we have here is the kinds of people who talk to Westerners tend to be against the regime. We fell into the same trap in Egypt during the Arab Spring, where the Egyptians that we talked to as Westerners were telling us that they want democracy, and we thought it expressed the desires of everyone. That's not really how it went down. I don't necessarily believe that Iran is ready to have a rebellion against I know that's not what you asked, but I think this is an important point. The drop of a hat. I think there's more support for the government than people think. I tend to be very skeptical of this kind of we can democratize and change everything very rapidly. The Middle East doesn't really work that way, including Iran. Mike asks, could you briefly explain why Israel seems to have given up the idea of a 1945 style occupation of Gaza, i.e., to destroy Hamas and rebuild Gaza from the ground up with institutions and a government friendly to Israel? Yeah, so there's two reasons for that. Obviously, one is a lot of people believe that that wouldn't work, that it's hard to impose a government on people from the outside. And another is because there's political concern in Israel that will lead to a two-state solution. And there's a lot of politicians in Israel and a lot of people in Israel who view that as a nightmare scenario. And honestly, I think a lot of them would rather have Hamas weakened there than move towards that. Shock Block Johnson asks, suppose after this war, the Palestinians start to abide by the rules of engagement and adhere to the Geneva Conventions. Could this legitimize the Palestinian armed struggle in the eyes of the world? If so, would that lead to open training and arming of Palestinian resistance groups like for Ukraine? And how would Israel deal with such a situation? Well, that doesn't seem very realistic, but if the Palestinians were to do that, research does show that political groups that follow international law and attack military targets only or military targets mostly tend to have a lot more influence on the policy of the country they're trying to influence than terrorist groups. Because the people in the country start to view their demands as more reasonable and view them less as trying to kill them all. One of the problems the Palestinians have now with Israelis is Israelis feel, and October 7th did not help with this, that Palestinians want to kill them all. If they felt like they just wanted to end the occupation, they would actually make a lot more gains and enjoy more international legitimacy and support. So this is actually a nightmare situation for Israelis who are against the two-state solution. For those of us who are for a two-state solution, that would be a good development. It would also lead to less civilian casualties, you would assume. I don't think Israel has a plan for that. I also don't think that's going to happen, at least not anytime soon. Finally, Vala Lovan asks, ever since the protests in the summer, I've had a personal fantasy that Gallant grabs four Likud MKs, walks over to Gantz, and offers their votes in a no confidence vote in exchange for a high place on Gantz's lists. Bibi already tried to fire Gallant. He's publicly very close buddies with Gantz. The fact that Bibi failed to sack him might show he's got the most protection of anyone in the Likud to maneuver. As for the others, Likud is polling so low that half of its MKs won't make it in the next time anyway. It seems like saving their jobs made sense to me. Why am I wrong? Okay, so I don't know if you're wrong, but we see something similar here to what we saw with the Republicans and Trump. There's so many people in the Likud who feel that Netanyahu is driving them off a cliff, but no one has the balls to come out and lead a rebellion. And when Gallant tried to come out and lead a rebellion, it's true that he didn't lose his job, but no one really joined him. And just like with the Republicans and Trump, we know the names of some people who are clearly not fans, but they haven't been willing to make a stand against Netanyahu. And that continues to happen. They worry, and they're correct, that if they go and move into Gantz's list, they'll be hated in the Likud. They'll have no power base of their own in Gantz's party, and their political career would be short. Instead, they hope to see Netanyahu removed and replace him in taking over the Likud. That way, they can possibly be prime ministers. So there is a calculation there that's understandable. Finally, you asked, um, doesn't Iran risk losing more face if they fire from Iran, the Israelis intercept their rockets? Doesn't it make them look like a joke? And yes, Iran risked that, and their solution to that has been to pretend that it's been a big victory. I don't know how far that's going to go, but the people who want to buy Iranian propaganda are buying it. Iran is managing to spin it as, standing up for the Palestinians against Israel. I think that they've avoided looking like a joke to their own supporters. To those who support Israel, they do look like a joke. They're not as worried about that. Okay, that's the end of this episode. If you like what I do here, consider supporting me on Patreon at Shael Media. Listen to my history podcast, History of the Land of Israel podcast, where I've just finished a trilogy on the 12 tribes, and I'm now working on an episode about King David. I will see you here next time something interesting happens, which I'm sure will be very soon.